to this book launch event of the book Catastrophic Grief, Trauma and Resilience in Child Concentration Camp Survivors, authored by Dr. Tracey Farber, Professor Gill, and Professor Cora Smith. And I will introduce them individually as the program continues. I'd like to say a very special thank you to the Christa Maria Trust for their immense and generous support. And also thank you for partnering with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center to make this book launch possible. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the presence today of Director Tali Nates, founder and executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our dear Marlene Bethlehem and her family, and to especially thank you, Marlene, for your support as well. I'd like to also thank Jeff Shankman for your support and work. Please may I request, before we officially start the program, that please put your cell phones on silent so that it doesn't disturb today's proceedings. Thank you. This book launch will be a launch as well as a discussion. Towards the end of the event, we will have a question and answer session where you can engage with the authors in a discussion. So please make sure that you have your questions and your comments ready for that session towards the end. To start today's event, it is my privilege to call upon our dear Marlene Bethlehem to address us.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and Tali, thank you for inviting me. I want to say two things. One thing about Tali, and then one thing about the book, because we're in for a treat. Johannesburg Holocaust Center has to be one of the luckiest Holocaust centers anywhere in the world, and I've been to a few. You've got a person here who is totally dedicated to the center, day in and day out. I hope that you all know she's been awarded by many countries, especially Poland, which is a special commemoration for Tali. Tali, we're so proud to have you here. I had the pleasure of working with Tali here for 8 years when we were building, and you have no idea the dedication that she puts into this Holocaust Center. The second thing is I want to say to you, Tracey. Tracey, I'm so pleased that you phoned me to say, where can I get some money? I have the privilege of being a trustee on the Christa Maria Will Trust. The money comes from Germany. Just think of the coincidence of this book launch and the money coming from Germany. I also know that this book is utterly amazing. I know all about the book launch in Israel, and I want to personally congratulate you. It's a topic that's very close to my heart, and we are all in for the most wonderful surprise, and please don't hesitate. Buy this wonderful book, and mazel tov to the three of you. Thank you for letting me come say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. None of us can possibly imagine the experience of a child during the Holocaust or any genocide. This book shares with us insights and memories of such experiences and describes the narratives of child Holocaust survivors and their experiences of complex trauma, complicated bereavement, aging, resilience, and existential loneliness. The work is unique in that it describes the trauma of child Holocaust survivors who were placed in concentration camps. Most children were killed on entry. Child survivors were rare. These survivors went on to build lives with considerable resilience and coping, but their trauma remained. This book is based on the research of Dr. Tracey Farber's PhD research, in which she interviewed 9 child Holocaust survivors who were interned in concentration camps. Professor Gill and Professor Cora Smith were the research supervisors. The authors have added original chapters discussing the relevant research and literature in the field of massive grief, complex trauma, and ethics. The first speaker I would like to call up is Dr. Tracey Farber. Dr. Tracey Farber worked full-time as a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, supervisor, and trainer in private practice for 24 years here in Johannesburg. She specialized in treating traumatized adults, adolescents, and children, and her work included seeing Holocaust survivors and second-generation Holocaust survivors for individual psychotherapy. At present, she works as a clinical psychologist at the Tel Aviv University Psychological Services and in private practice in Tel Aviv, where she works as a psychotherapist with both English and Hebrew speakers. Recently, she started to run psychotherapy support groups for both the parents of Israeli Defense Force soldiers and also for new immigrants. She developed a psychoeducational program called Understanding Trauma and Building Resilience that was developed from her PhD research. This program has been taught to mental health workers, students, teachers, and parents both in South Africa and in Israel. At this moment, I'd like to invite Dr. Tracey Farber to address us.
Firstly, thank you everybody for coming. It was very exciting. It made me really happy to see so many colleagues and friends that I haven't seen for so long. So I'm just going to put my water down and start speaking. So, special thanks for everybody who came today. And I'm going to start introducing what I want to speak about by reading the memorial of the book. So the book was memorialized, and this is on the first few pages. In memoriam of my family who were killed during the Holocaust with the 6 million. My great-grandmother Merrill Farber and my great-uncle Yehuda Farber, who were shot and killed in mass graves in a forest near Yanova, Lithuania. My great-grandfather Shimon Yuri Dana and my great-grandmother Chana Dana, who were killed in the Dvinsk ghetto in Latvia. I honor the memory of my beloved grandfathers, Dave Farber and Max Dana, who suffered these tragic losses. I was their firstborn grandchild, and I carry their stories told and untold. My younger brothers were their pride and joy, a reminder of their younger masculine selves who had survived pogroms and anti-Semitism. They are remembered with love, and their legacy lives on in their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, many of whom are here today. So thank you for coming, my cousins. I wanted to start by saying that our launch was mentioned. We had a launch in Tel Aviv, and it was the online launch of our book at the Tel Aviv University. And Alberto Mesciani, the Director of Psychological Services, made a very important point that I want to speak about today. he said then that the book acts as a reminder of what happens when children suffer trauma and when they suffer the trauma of war. And he said there and then that we have to worry not only about our own Israeli children, but also Palestinian children, Christian children, all children in the Middle East who are potentially hurt by war. And he said that, and not less than a month later, we found ourselves in a terrible war, which is still happening. Unfortunately, tragically, it started off with a massacre and has turned into a war. And so now his words ring really true about the relevance of what's going to happen to children. And our book speaks about the long-term effects of trauma. I interviewed aging people, and we looked at how the trauma of war and the loss of parents affected them over their lifespan. There's also been a surge of worldwide anti-Semitism that has been deeply upsetting for many of us. So to start off, our first thank you goes to the research participants, the Holocaust survivors, who opened their hearts and told their stories with so much generosity, and it wasn't always easy for them. I'd also like to thank Don Krause, who unfortunately can't be here today. He does know about the launch, and I went to see him the other day to give him a copy of the book. He was instrumental in helping us to construct the questionnaire. And so in that way, our research is quite unique in that we had a Holocaust survivor actually helping us to develop the research. I'd like to thank Jeff Shankman for his support in funding the publication of this book, and also for being a friend who's always there to consult and to support in whatever the three of us are doing as a group. I'd also like to thank Jeff for funding the social services at the Jewish Community Services. What we did was we took our research and we went to Jewish Community Services and said, our Holocaust survivors need a psychosocial program. Jeff has funded that, and we now have social workers who are in touch with and providing psychosocial services and also financial help to survivors in need. And we're very, very happy that Jeff heard us and he actually was able to do something concrete with the results that we found. Marlene, thank you so much, and thank you to the Christa Maria Trust for Holocaust Education. This is a special trust that works with Holocaust education, and we're so grateful not only for supporting the launch, funding the book, but for also your very generous donation to the Holocaust Museum in honor of our book. And for us, that is something that we're very, very moved by. Also, the Christa Maria Trust have earmarked our book as an important tool in the fight against anti-Semitism, and for that we're enormously grateful. I'd also like to thank the Jewish Social Services for doing what they could to set up a program for Holocaust survivors. Tali Nates, who we all know, the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Museum, was involved with me right from the beginning. She helped me to select participants and gave me always historical background as we went along. And it helped us to look at the historical side. And I also want to thank you, Tali, for writing us a wonderful review. We were so happy with it that we actually put it on the back of the book. And we really are so grateful. Evelyn Pipers, who's over here, is honouring us with her presence. Evie, thank you so much for coming today. Evie is the wife of Shlomo Pipers, who was one of our participants, and when I interviewed him, he begged me to write his story. I couldn't at the time because I was doing my research, but I tried to refer him to somebody, it just didn't work out, and Evie gave us her blessing when I said that I could potentially write about Shlomo, she said, please, I want you to talk about him in his name and not talk about him as a participant. And she gave us his pictures, which are included in the book. And we're very grateful for this, because with psychological research, all our participants are anonymous, but with Shlomo, because of this, we actually have his own personal book, pictures in the book, which make it also historical. So thank you, Ebby. I would like to thank my co-authors and supervising professors, Professor Gill Eagle and Professor Cora Smith. For those of you who don't know, Cora and Gill are not Jewish, and they have devoted 20 years of their lives to this research. And I can't tell you what a long road it's been. I wasn't always the easiest student by any means. I really, really wasn't. And they have devoted themselves not only to the research, but invested in me personally on so many levels, and really helping me to achieve something that I didn't think was on the cards, not the PhD, nor the book. And I'm so deeply grateful to both of you. I struggled for many, many years to finish. I had a mental block about writing the testimony. I was also working in trauma, so it was really, really hard. And in the last, I really completed the research under fire. I was threatened towards the end. And if I don't do it, there's no PhD. And that was what finally got it to work. And since then, we've published 2 journal articles, and we've now completed the book. And I'm so grateful that you're both with me. I want to say something brief about my family. Firstly, my mother isn't here today. She couldn't be here with us, unfortunately. Mom, I hope you're watching from home. Thank you so much for reading stories to me when I was a little girl. I know you read me so many stories, and I remember so many of them. I think that it definitely must have given me a passion for telling stories and hearing stories, and I'm really sorry that you couldn't be here. I love you, and please God, we'll all be home to see you later this afternoon. I have to say, without talking as if this is a bat mitzvah speech, that my 3 brothers have been absolute beacons of light in different ways in getting me through this. During my writer's block, my 2 brothers, I was desperate. I said, boys, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm under pressure now. I don't know how I'm going to write this. They had the genius idea of giving me an office in their company. And so every day I would come, and it helped me because I was less traumatized. I had distraction. They would come in, take me for lunch, sit with me, make me tea, ask me how I was every step of the way. And so Gordon and Ashley, you were a huge help. Thank you so much, boys. While I was in Israel, it was difficult. I wrote the book in Israel, converting it, working with Gill and Cora, and Rowan was instrumental in support in so many ways, in helping me to complete the research project, turning it into a book, phoning me. Thank you, boy, I appreciate it. Thank you also to my sister-in-laws and my whole family for all their support. I really, really appreciate it. I have to say a quick thank you to my nieces, Kix, Gab, Han, who isn't here, and my special cousin and bestie, Kiara and David. Thank you for having me, and so happy you both are here today. And thank you to the rest of my family. My auntie is watching from Australia. Thank you for helping with the proofread, and I appreciate so much all the effort that you've put in. Before I start, just to say that my grandmother, Dolly Farber, was a beacon of light. I remember her with my dad, who always believed in me and pushed me, and I hope that they're with us in spirit. The seeds of this book was sown, and I'm reading from the book now, many decades ago in Johannesburg. As a child, I watched my two grandfathers playing cards at the dining room table and heard them speaking Yiddish as they sipped on black tea with strawberry jam. I watched them speaking in an animated way in a language that had a beautiful sound, but I didn't understand a word. They both called me Tracey, a Yiddish diminutive of my name that no one has called me before or since. I knew I belonged. They put the stamp of the sound of their Eastern European accent on my English name. I felt connected to them and to their culture, and this sense of identification made me want to know more about their families. My journey to understand my lost grandparents who'd been killed in the Holocaust led me to this research, and in an effort to prepare for the research, I met survivors in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires, and in addition, I went to Warsaw, Auschwitz, and the Majdanek concentration camps. What I want to say is that the research was incredibly difficult and it was extremely traumatic, not only for me, but for everybody who was involved in helping me. Levo Faladi is here. He was my research assistant, and he helped me during his BA, which was many, many years ago. And he's now an advocate who's graced us with his presence. And Levo, thank you for your help. Honestly, it wasn't just the research help, but also that we sat and processed and discussed the cases together. So when we talk about the research and the catastrophic grief, what we're talking about is not just grief, but the depth and the intensity of the grief, of what happened when survivors, child survivors or adolescents lost their parents, had them ripped away from them, and also had to lose siblings, community, and everything that they knew. And in order to communicate what catastrophic grief is, I'm going to read you one example. We have 9 stories that we tell. I'm going to read about Shlomo, who I mentioned earlier on. He was a child survivor from Poland who was 79 at the time of the interview. And, thanks. So he was 79 at the time of the interview, and he was 11 years old when the Holocaust happened. And this is how he described what happened to him. He said he remembered his mother crying when his 2 brothers were taken away to concentration camps. He said that this separation from his mother was particularly traumatic. Shlomo, his parents, and his sister were taken to a soccer field for selection with other Jews in 1942. The Germans kept them captive for 3 days and 3 nights without food. It rained continuously and there was no shelter. He said that the intention was to weaken them. There were 3 points of selection. He, his sister, and their father were allowed to pass through. However, his mother was stopped at the gate and sent to Auschwitz. He was told that she was going to a work camp, and he recalled that there was no time to say goodbye, no time to say anything, he said. He never saw her again because she was killed in Auschwitz. Shlomo told me that even as an old man of 80, it was difficult for him to go to a cemetery because he felt that there was absolutely no closure. And so all the survivors that I interviewed spoke about a catastrophic grief that they carried through with them for a lifetime. It was a grief that they never got over. So, when we talk about this level of grief, we talk about what we wrote about, which was a trauma trilogy. And this was an article that Gill, Cora, and I wrote, which was to crystallize the level of the grief. That when we unpacked the survivor guilt and the anger, what we found beneath that was a catastrophic grief. And that many of them were angry, and that when they had a survivor guilt, this was particularly paralyzing. And what Meirav Roth, one of our psychoanalysts in Israel, says that when people suffer from surviving grief, they identify with the person that's dead, and it's almost as if they become like the dead man walking, and it stifles their life instinct. And we know that any trauma survivors, when they carry huge amounts of survivor guilt, it's particularly debilitating. And this is what we spoke about in our Trauma Trilogy article, which is available online. The other thing I wanted to mention was the existential loneliness that many of them felt, that they felt nobody understood them, even till the present day. And it was too difficult for many of them to even tell their stories. One must say that in spite of all the pain, there was enormous resilience. There was an ability to walk forward, to build lives, to educate about the Holocaust, to care about other children. And this was particularly moving to watch. And for many of them, they had enduring symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so even though they functioned, it was as if, metaphorically, they carried the shrapnel of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that was embedded inside them, in their bodies, in their psyches, while they continued to function. And we were all extremely moved by their bravery and the way that they battled on. I would like to read a quote that was written by Dorila, who was himself a Holocaust survivor, and he became a psychoanalyst. The dead continue to be acutely and painfully absent. Homelessness and utter aloneness continue to haunt the survivor, even if he or she is able to build a family, a community, and a home. The traumatic experience remains unfinished between the survivor and the perpetrator. So Dory Lau could put this into words for us, that even though there was resilience, there was enormous suffering. I would like to end with a prayer for peace in the Middle East and the end to suffering for all children. As a Jew, I would also like to pray, and not only as a Jew, because I know we have many people praying for us. I would like to pray for the release of the hostages. We know that they've got a very, very difficult road ahead of them, but we pray for their release and for their safe return home. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for witnessing this talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracey. Thank you, Tracey, for that really moving tribute to your family, but also that prayer. Thank you. And now, Professor Cora Smith. Professor Cora Smith is adjunct professor in the Division of Clinical Psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Witwatersrand. She also holds a joint appointment post as the Chief Clinical Psychologist at the Child, Adolescent and Family Unit at Johannesburg Hospital. Her interests are in the development of personality pathology through the life cycle, with a particular focus on attachment. She has a keen interest in the ethical dilemmas that emerge in clinical practice. At this moment in time, I'd like to invite Professor Cora Smith to address us.
Well, thank you to everyone. Am I having a new mic? Oh, I'm fine. Okay. Thank you to everyone for being here. And thank you to the director, Tally Nates, and to Vix Applebaum for organising all this. I don't think you remember when you met me, but when we started this research, it was the time Steven Spielberg was doing all those. This is humming a bit, is that okay? Can you hear? So he was getting those tapes together, and there were some Holocaust survivors present, and they wanted to meet the supervisor. I think they were deeply suspicious because I wasn't Jewish. So off I went to this tea, you know, the proverbial pork chop at a synagogue, and I met them. And I sit on the ethics committee, the research ethics committee at WITS, and when the research came through, you have to get ethics approval. So here we're saying, now we're going to interview these Holocaust survivors, I'm going to ask them all these ugly questions, and I got a hell of a pushback, mainly from the Jewish people on the committee, to say, you can't do this, it's too traumatic, you can't, that's unethical, blah, 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 a whole lot of story. I go back and we tell Don Krauts, and he says, do they understand what we went through? Do they think a few fakakta questions are going to make a difference? So I repeated what he said, and the research went through. That was the end of it. I want to thank Tracey and Gill for all this work. You know, it's been nearly 20 years, and I was thinking most marriages don't last that long. When we started this research, I said to Tracey, you've got to do a PhD. And you know, she said, yeah, do you believe I can do it? Yes, I can, blah, blah, blah. And they said, then we're going to do a book. She looked at me like I'm mad. I'll forget that. Anyway, we've put in our own chapters, but you only have to read mine. And I want to particularly say thanks to Jeff Shankman. Jeff, where are you? Jeff, thank you. Jeff helped us financially to get into an American publishing place. And please buy the book with a clean heart, because neither Gill, Eagle, or I will get any financial benefit. We're declined. And Tracey will cover her costs, and then we'll donate. So just so that you know that. And I just had the pleasure of meeting Marlene Bethlehem from the Christa Maria Trust. Thank you so much for that. But of course, the big thank you goes to the Holocaust survivors, who were absolutely amazing. So we're deeply grateful to them. So, okay, what I want to really talk about is the particular contribution I made to the book. And what I want to talk about here is that something unique about this book that I've not seen in any other research is there is work on some child Holocaust survivors. Not a lot, but it's cross-sectional. They do an interview or they do a set of questionnaires. So for those who don't know, you have in-depth work, you do a small sample with, 50 hours or 90 hours or whatever it is we've got, and then you do a cross-sectional, which is a huge population, and you do a questionnaire on them. So we've done this one, but I have not seen one piece of research that looks at them over 75 years. Now, you see the difference in trauma. So we know they went off, they're very rare, they get killed when they go to the camps, so they're very, very few. So we can actually watch what happens over 70 years, and that's quite amazing. So I want to make 3 salient points. The first I'm going to talk about is temporality. Now, temporality refers to the notion of deferred revision of meaning to the original event. What does that mean? It means that in the current context with the Holocaust survivors, they reinterpret an emotional experience that occurred at a later date. So they look back. And what is unique about this, there are concepts in psychoanalysis, apreku or nachtrachtlikheid, all those kind of things where you look back and you reinterpret things. But remember, these are children. Now when they become adults, they think with adult minds and they realize things that they didn't realize when they were little. So sometimes that helps you with resilience, but sometimes it serves as an additional trauma, and it inflicts further pain. So I'm going to give you an example. One of our Holocaust survivors celebrated his bar mitzvah in the camp. So his father gives him a watch as a present. It's the only valuable thing the father's got. And later, the boy's told the father's going to move to Buchenwald. And he wants to commemorate or somehow say something valuable to his father. So he takes the watch and he slips it into his father's pocket. It's a gesture of goodwill. At the time, he wanted his father to understand it was a gift of love. Years later, he was tormented because he thought his father was probably upset and angry when he found the watch. He felt tremendous guilt at the thought that his father might have thought he rejected his precious gift. He reported that he continued to feel guilty and sad about it, even though he did this as a 13-year-old boy. And at 75 years, he had no closure. His words, no closure. With the advance of age and maturity and experience, he realized retrospectively that his good intention to please his father deprived him of his legacy of a special gift. What is interesting about this is it's not a once-off trauma. Every time he thinks of it, it traumatizes him. The next point I want to talk about is the ethics of survivor guilt. Now, we talk about survivor guilt when people survive and you feel funny about the ones who didn't, but I'm going to talk about the ethics where some of the things that plague our survivors was things they had to do to survive. So, I've always been influenced by Primo Levi. He is an Italian Holocaust survivor. He was captured quite late in the war, and he wrote a book about how the practices of the Nazis were designed to make camp inmates turn on each other. So, for example, when he entered into Auschwitz, you had to have a spoon to get a meal, but they didn't give you a spoon. He didn't have shoes, he didn't have a coat, and without these, it was very difficult to survive. So you stole a spoon, or a jacket, or shoes, of someone who was weaker, and hastened their death. Primo Levi said the worst thing the Nazis did to us was turn the victims into accomplices. And he wrote extensively about this, this long-term destructive, dehumanizing impact that this Nazi practice had. The book was called If This Is a Man. In America it was published under a different name, Survival in Auschwitz, but it came back as this. And he was saying, is this what human beings are? So he felt that was the worst crime, that by dehumanizing the victims, they turned them into the very monsters that their captors were. In 1986, he wrote about overcoming his own hatred, saying that he felt it was bestial and crude. He said he tried very hard to base all his decisions on reason. And I'll quote him, he says, "Much less do I accept hatred directed collectively at an ethnic group. For example, all the Germans. If I accepted it, I would feel that I was following the precepts of Nazism and was founded precisely on the national racial hatred." So all of the survivors in the current study suffered survivor guilt, even though they were minors at the time. A few had deep regret at some of the actions. One of the Holocaust survivors who I saw in therapy, which was not in the study, she was 14 years old and trying to survive. Her parents had been taken to Auschwitz. She was left alone, and she was literally trying to survive on her own. And she survived by trading sex for food, sometimes with German soldiers. She has never forgiven herself for this. Now, many of the ethical debates that revolve around the actions undertaken by some survivors to survive in the Holocaust center on the concept of context. Within the context of a concentration camp, how do we understand that some people behaved in inhumane ways towards their fellow inmates? I found a very obscure paper written in the 1980s by an American man called Langer, who to my mind has given a far better argument than I've ever read anywhere else about the moral actions. And what he does is Langer says it's not that we should look at the morality of choices according to the context of the survivors. Instead, we should dispute the fact that there were choices at all. So he says the choices facing the Holocaust survivors were not meaningful choices. As a consequence, the behavior in the camps cannot be judged according to those kind of standards we might give in ordinary societies. What we have to understand is what the Holocaust survivors had to look at was that they were what he called choiceless choices. And he gives an example. There's a group of inmates that he marched off to the gas chambers, and there's an old man who's not coping, and he sits down to rest. And one of the guards comes and threatens to beat him to death. So he hurries back in line, and he begs for his life. And the point here is it's a choiceless choice. He's not choosing between life and death. He's just choosing between one form of humiliation or another. He's going to die anyway. Okay, so I think this is a much more helpful and compelling argument to look at these kinds of actions and how to understand them. So, what is it that makes us lose our humanity through trauma? Now I'm going to do the dangerous thing. We're going to look at current collective trauma. So as the current events unfold in the Middle East, we all watch in horror. And as my friend and colleague Pinker says to me, They're creating new depths of hell even Dante didn't think of. But what I see is collective trauma unfolding in real time. I see my Jewish and Muslim colleagues and friends try and cope with the events that are unfolding. My Jewish friends and colleagues come to my office and they show me their phones and pictures of the slaughter of 7 October. They're distressed. They're angry. They're frightened. My Muslim friends and colleagues come in, show me these terrible pictures of dead bodies on the rubble of Gaza. They are distressed and angry and frightened. This is what collective trauma looks like. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, sorry. But what I notice is that there's not much empathy for the victims of the other side. What has happened? My friends and colleagues have turned into psychopaths overnight. Well, of course not. When we become traumatized, certain things happen to us. I could describe the theoretical tenets of trauma and how the psychological defense system is punctured, or how your neurochemistry is altered and the abnormal regulation of cortisol and stress hormones occur, or how the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is activated, all of which is correct and true. But it's also true that most of you in this room are too traumatized to hear me. So I will try and reach you through metaphor. When we are traumatized, certain visitors come to our heart. They are the visitors of fear and rage and hatred and revenge and helplessness, pain, confusion, even spite. And as these visitors move into our hearts, the residents of compassion and empathy pack their bags and they leave. Empathy sometimes leaves an overnight bag. We have a limited amount of empathy, but only for our own side. The residents of reason and logic also pack their bags. They reside in your brain. And now you are left with an angry, hurt, frightened, vengeful person without any reasoning capacities and impaired empathy. And as your Bubbas would have said to you, you're now thinking with your tuchus and not with your sale. I watch in utter disbelief as the Foreign Minister of America, Antony Blinken, and Rishi Sunak of the UK, and Emmanuel Macron of France, and our own dear Cyril Ramaphosa, bless his little socks, offered to mediate peace talks with a group of enraged people without any reasoning abilities. You can't put peace talks on the table when the table's on fire. Now the problem is this: if we allow the visitors of fear and rage and revenge and helplessness and pain and spite to take up residence in our heart, we will lose our humanity, as Primo Levi warns us. We will become like our tormentors. Years ago, I visited the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria and found one of the most powerful quotes of rage and hatred I've ever read. To be fair, it was in German, so it had to be translated. But it said this: if there is a God, he will have to beg for our forgiveness. So what have we learned from the child Holocaust survivors? And what do they teach us about trauma? They too were filled with rage and hatred and revenge, but they did not let these visitors take up residence in their hearts. They developed relationships, they had families, they built careers, they contributed to the community and to broader society. Now, I'm not advocating a kumbaya forgiveness moment. There are some things that cannot be forgiven. The Holocaust is one, apartheid is another. Our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission was led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and was placed within the Christian tenets of religion and forgiveness. Something many resent to this day. What is clear, though, from the many studies on forgiveness is that forgiveness is not required for reconciliation or to find a way to live together. What is needed is a constitution that enshrines human rights and enables people to have a decent life, a good place to live, food on the table, decent school for your kids. We all want the same things. We might fight about how to get there. Research in psychology also suggests that we do not forgive and forget. We tend rather to sort of forget and then sort of forgive, unless reminded. So I think the process of what's happening is the residents of compassion and empathy and reason and logic return, and the visitors of fear and hatred and rage and revenge slowly go away, but they visit occasionally and then go again. This is how we regain our humanity. It's how we continue with life. So what has to happen for these visitors of rage and fear and retaliation to go? What does the study teach us? What do these child Holocaust survivors tell us? Well, we know that all the Holocaust survivors in the study... Oh, thank you. And just as well, I haven't... I'm a big prick because I'm 65, so I'm managing without the glasses. Well, what the study shows us is the ones that were most likely to regain their compassion and their reason were the ones that were well attached, that came from good families, and who were well attached before their parents were murdered. So I know my colleagues and friends very well. They come from good families, they're well attached, they will settle. The residents of compassion and reason will finally return. So I will leave you with this. You all remember that 85-year-old Israeli hostage that was recently released by Hamas. You can see the clip on YouTube. If you haven't seen, go look. She is Yocheved Lifshitz. We're told she was well treated. She was kidnapped on a motorbike. They tied up her hands, they beat her hands, they marched her around for several hours in the underground tunnel. If you think that's good treatment of an 85-year-old, your standards are lower than mine. But I concede it could have been worse. So in the video, you see her walking slowly with her Hamas captor towards the Red Cross handover point. She's in a daze. She looks in the dwell. That is what trauma looks like. This is not a whoopie-doo-dah moment for Yocheved. She knows her husband's still in captivity. She doesn't know if he's alive or dead. She doesn't know if he's being tortured. She knows he's not getting his medication. Nobody in Gaza is getting their medication. And as she's handed over to the Red Cross by her Hamas captor, she turns and she lifts that frail 85-year-old hand, wrinkles and its little spots, and she shakes her Hamas captor's hand and she says, Shalom. Now I need a tissue. You should be very proud of that moment, because in that moment, what Yocheved Lifshitz does with that simple gesture, she says to her Hamas captor, you will not take away my humanity. So don't let them take yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cora. And I do acknowledge the tears that I notice around the room. Thank you very much for that. Now, Professor Gill. Professor Gill is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Witwatersrand. She was previously involved in the training of clinical psychology students at a master's level and is also a core member of the doctoral team overseeing research work. Her research interests lie in the field of psychological studies, psychosocial studies, with a particular focus on traumatic stress and gender issues. She runs a small private practice working primarily within a relational psychoanalytic psychotherapy framework. At this moment, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Professor Gill to address us.
Is that close enough? Everyone can hear me. Yeah. I think it's quite hard to speak after Cora and Tracey, but Cora particularly leaving us with, I think, a very profound sense of being moved by what you've brought. And I really want to again echo the thanks to all the people who made the research possible, who've made the launch possible, who've supported the project over so many years. But particularly to acknowledge Tracey, who did 76 hours of interviews with elderly people who, I can't use a word other than generous. They were really generous in the way that they shared their life stories with Tracey. But I think because she was a clinical psychologist and able to talk to people with such profound compassion and understanding, the level of sharing is remarkable. And I was re-looking at the book, and I know this research really well, and I still feel enormously emotionally affected by what I read every time I look at that material. When you read the book, those of you who've bought copies of the book, you'll see that it's sort of structured in a way in which we attempted to do justice to each individual case history and case story. And again, there are some the images within those narratives that are really difficult to comprehend and to process. And then I suppose because we are researchers and people who are also wanting to try and develop some kind of understanding from this research, we also looked at what we called cross-case analyses. And I'm going to talk a bit about the issue of complex post-traumatic stress and how we came to understand aspects of that within the research. So one of the tensions in the literature around writing about the impact of the Holocaust on survivors has been a debate about really whether one emphasizes the damage people suffered in terms of dominantly of their mental health, or whether one emphasizes their resilience. And you will see a kind of constant shift between those two things. And I think ultimately, in the way perhaps that both Cora and Tracey have spoken about, what one has to understand is that there is both and. People carry damage and they carry enormous resilience. But I think there's part of understanding the mental health impact is a sort of political act. It's a way of saying people should not be subject to these kinds of extraordinary life circumstances in which their psychological being is harmed by what has happened to them. And I think similarly during the apartheid years, people like Sandler and Foster wrote a book about the impact of detention and torture on survivors from a mental health perspective, as a kind of political act to say, no more, this should not be happening to people. And this book, I think, also is a way of saying, no more, these kinds of things should never be visited on human beings. To talk a bit more about complex post-traumatic stress, it's a notion that is mostly associated with Judith Herman's work. She first introduced this construct. And it's an idea that beyond traumatic stress, which has more of this fight-flight feel that we know, the sort of sense of focus on your immediate survival, with complex PTSD, she argued that people who were kept in situations of chronic traumatization, long-term, inescapable traumatization over an extended period of time, in which in many instances there were multiple acts of traumatization, what one found is that not only were there post-traumatic stress symptoms, the kinds of symptoms we know of startle response, nightmares, but additional symptoms started to develop. And the way we understand it is that you have to adapt to that context. You have to survive within that context. And that in order to do that, the kinds of survival or adaptation strategies you develop can start to become characterological. They can start to become almost kind of a permanent way of being. So for children in very traumatizing households, for example, dissociation, the ability to kind of disconnect your feeling state from your awareness of what is happening in reality, starts to become functional because the kinds of feeling states you have are too overwhelming to tolerate. Herman saw the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors as a population that very much represented a complexly traumatized population who presented, for example, with quite a lot of physical symptoms, somatic symptoms as we would call them, very often were predisposed to depression. But as Cora has emphasized, and as we discovered in looking at people's sort of life trajectories, there was something about these survivors where a lot of the features that are seen to be part of complex PTSD were not present in these survivors. So in the diagnostic systems, the diagnosis of complex PTSD has been adopted in the International Classification of Diseases system. What they argue is that in addition to your traumatic stress symptoms, what you have are what they call disorders of self. So your sense of self-cohesion and stability is compromised. And also, in addition to that, what you have are problematic patterns in your interpersonal relationships. And very often with people who've been complexly traumatized, what we see are repeats of patterns of perpetrator-victim kinds of dynamics. So very often people unconsciously repeat the pattern of being, in a sense, subject to a kind of persecution that they experienced in the complexly traumatizing environment, even when they are no longer in that environment. Now, in the case of these survivors, we saw quite a lot of the features of exaggerated PTSD or traumatic stress symptoms. We didn't see the sort of features of disordered self and the problematic relational patterns, what I would call the more kind of borderline features that are often overlap between complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder. So these are not people who tend to abuse alcohol, for example, or act out their feelings in ways that are harmful to other people and harmful to themselves. In fact, as I think, again, both Cora and Tracey have said, these are people who, all of whom married, all of whom lived very functional lives, but carried their trauma in a very particular way, locked up inside of them. So even in relation to dissociation, it wasn't so much that their thinking and their feeling were separated out. What we found is what we refer to as compartmentalization, is that during the research, when Tracey asked them about their early experiences, most of them, within minutes, could connect to imagery, very powerful, evocative, visceral kind of imagery of what they had experienced and witnessed in the camps. But it had been locked away. It's kept as a kind of separate set of life experiences that could be accessed very quickly, but mostly was kept separate from the functional lives that they lived on an everyday basis. And in fact, I think in order to survive after the Holocaust, in many instances, they'd been dissuaded from talking about their experiences. I think people found it intolerable. A lot of them some had gone to Israel, some had come to South Africa, or some had come via Israel to South Africa. But a lot of them found in the homes that they came to after that people didn't really want to know about their experiences. I think people felt that they needed to get on with their lives. So we tried to think a bit about what was the difference in this instance that you were not seeing some of the kind of pathology you might expect from people who have been subject to such terrible torture as you will read and dehumanization and infrahumanization as you will read in their testimonies. And I think the two things that we wanted to sort of emphasize, the first is really that for those of them, and most of them, had had good early attachments, and Cora emphasized that too. They were able to, in our psychological terms, retain a sense of good objects inside themselves. I think one of the ways of simplifying perhaps how we think of things psychologically is that what we understand is people's life experiences are internalized in some ways, and they create the ways in which you represent the world and yourself and relationships with other people. And those are mostly based on your early experiences, but significant enough later experience can also change your internal world. And the way in which your internal world is structured affects then how you relate to people in the external environment. And I think what we were able to say in the case of these 9 survivors, and it is a small sample and we weren't specifically looking, doing the research in relation to complex PTSD, is that something about their ability to hold on to good internal objects. People who tried to protect them from the harms in the camps, people who had loved them before the things happened to them in the camps, that enabled them to go forward in life holding on to something that felt good and good enough for them. However, one of the other things we need to think about is that what was very difficult for them is we want our good objects to be powerful. We want our good objects to be more potent than bad objects in the world. And for many of them, where they suffered terribly was around the fact that very often their parents were helpless to protect themselves and helpless sometimes to protect them from harm, however much their impulse was to do that. And I think what Tracey saw is that in interviewing people in their 70s and 80s, in this end-of-life stage in which you're trying to kind of, what Erickson refers to as integrity versus despair, do I come down on the side of saying life has been worth living, what I've contributed to life has been worth living, or do I come down on the side of despair? That there's something about having lived in a world in which, in a sense, you'd been through a period of time where the bad had outweighed the good for a long time, or your good objects can be rendered impotent, if I could put it in that way, that for them that meant that a lot of their existential belief or their spiritual belief or their trust in God, and your quote, Cora, from the camp sort of resonates with that, the sense that where can I trust in the good in the world? And I suppose where I sort of would want to end also is that I think what we learned from the research is that early attachment or exposure to people who care about you and who demonstrate an attempt, in whatever way they can, an attempt to protect you from harm, to reinforce a sense of self-esteem and value, that is vital for all of us as human beings. But also to try and create a world in which people can trust that the good outweighs the bad, that social structure regulates things, protects one from harm, and that all of us should be working to try and contribute to both those things so that people do not have to live in traumatized states, and that those traumatized states don't affect other people around them. So to really echo, I think, what Cora has said, I think there's profound learning from the research, and that the learning is that really the learning is that people can transcend terrible trauma and become people with humanity and live their lives in ways that are constructive for them and constructive for other people. So, but thank you all for being here, really having an audience who want to be part of the project and who have come with such care has also meant a great deal to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gill. And as you were speaking, I thought about myself and my trauma, and I think many of us have our own personal or family trauma, that this can help us relate to that. Thank you very much. At this point in time, I'd like to invite our authors to please take the seats and engage in a discussion with our audience.
And I would like to open the...
Thank you. Yes. So I'll take my first question here, Tabitha, and then I'll go to you and you as well.
Thank you so much. Wow. So, such an amazing, important book. Congratulations to all three of you. Gill, perhaps I can start with you. You spoke about the integrity and despair. And you spoke about, all of you spoke about the home growing up. I wonder if you can reflect on significant goodness by people in the camp system. And because we know about Shlomo, I will just refer to Shlomo, that had an amazing welder that taught him welding, that looked after him, and there was goodness there. And if you can reflect about that importance, please.
Yes, I think that is a really important point to make. And Tracey emphasizes that in the book, is that for some of the survivors, they had been protected not only by people in their own families, but by people who were compassionate towards it. One of whom was one of the staff members of one who called that in the camps. Some were Gentiles, some people who protected people. And I think you're absolutely right that in a way those actions stopped the kind of generalization that all people other than my people, or people who have a reason to be attached to me. Not all people are bad. There are good people. There are people who will take care of me for the sake that I'm a human being, or that I'm a child, or that I need care and attention. So I think you're absolutely right that it's so important in trauma very often, because I think it's the thing Cora was referring to, is that when harm is inflicted by a person, very often people start to associate the whole group with their antagonistic feelings, or their feelings of fear directed towards that whole group. And when one can have actions that allow one not to generalize in that kind of way, when there are people who behave in different kinds of ways, it's much, I suppose I would just, it's much healthier for one psychically, because then you have to hold on to the complexity that we have good and bad in us, and other people have good and bad in us. Yeah. Thanks, Lynn.
Hi, this is Ruth here. My name is Mo, and just congratulations. That was extraordinary, and I've learned so much. I'm very grateful that the Jewish Social Services have a facility for helping those people who have come through the experiences that you talk about. But I fear that people like myself, who are third generation, fourth generation survivors, are suffering from intergenerational traumas, that we haven't let go many of the kinds of things that you're talking about, but it manifests differently. So what I'm hearing you saying is that at an individual level, the kind of assistance that Jewish social welfare would be able to give people may well help them to come around and to regain humanity, displace some of the fear, anger, rage, and so on, and to take on compassion. But I fear that so many of us, I suspect, that many of us sitting in this room are actually carrying many consequences of this PTSD. And that we need to talk about it. And I want to put out a request to Tally and the Centre to think about this next step, right? This next set of generations, ourselves. And even my son, who's the next generation, is carrying that stuff. It's so unconscious, it's just in the ether. It's not in the, it's me. And I really think that group work would be extraordinary, and wouldn't it be amazing if the centre could set something up, a facility up that allows us to talk about some of these things in our lives. And I really would appeal for that kind of working together in a more collective way to try and unpack what has happened to ourselves.
Thank you.
I'll come to you with that. If I could just firstly make a statement to Tracey and Gill and Cora. I was fortunate enough to be involved in the raw data from the interviews with Tracey. I mean, what they were able to do in capturing what these survivors went through and just who they are and their stories is something I really implore everyone to read. I think, Cora, what you said just took me down such an emotional path because there was so much healing for me when I read that. I was about 23 years old and I was at a very critical time in my life. And when I read some of those stories, they took me to a place where I had to start understanding my own parents' inequities and failures. Because part of the stories that the survivors would tell is how when they reached the age at which their parents died, they struggled a lot with who they were at that point and had to go and think about what their parents went through then, knowing that they would be leaving their child at such a tender age. And for them as parents to think about how do we then parent beyond this because we've never seen that. And so my experience in all of this helped me get to terms with my dad not being there and my mom not being the person. In our conversations with Tracey, there was so much liberation of carrying certain burdens and carrying certain expectations from parents that were forced. And I love what Cora indicates, that isn't a choice at all. Because at the end of the day, when you are built and when you're born and raised in a system that doesn't really give you a choice, it's also very hard to then understand that your parents also don't have choices. So I speak from my parents' trauma from about date. I speak from some of the choices or lack thereof that they had to make that then resulted in how I grew up. And reflecting back, it's also helped me understand that certain circumstances are so beyond you that sometimes you have to be thankful that at least the person is alive and is still there because you carry that with you. And I'll give an example of one thing that really hit me during the research was one of the guys who had survived was in South Africa, and so he was asked, have you seen the people in the ghettos and how they live, and you see how many black people are in South Africa, how do you feel? And he was very flippant in his response, but what you had to understand was what he had to do in those concentration camps was so dehumanizing that it's, as Cora points out, it's like a questionnaire is not going to hurt these guys if you know what they really went through. And I always just ask that, please read this book. Let this book reflect on your lives, because there's so much that is untold and unsaid and is in the ether that we need to start grappling with. And just, I can't thank you guys enough. As I said, for me, it was 13, 14 years ago, and I still live with it because it helps me know that there is love and life at the visitors, the great dwellers in the heart, Cora, as you said. Those are the ones that we should fight to keep in our hearts, and know that even the other guys that come and visit ought not to stay there forever. And I live by that saying, and I'm thankful to have been part of this, and I can't thank you enough for that opportunity, Tracey.
Thank you. Jill, thank you for asking the question. Obviously, I had to prioritize some stuff and leave other stuff out, but the book makes a very important point about the developmental disruption of trauma. In every case, we explain at what age the person was traumatized, what the losses were, and we use Erickson and Erickson's psychosocial stages to look at where every child was on that continuum when there were traumas and how they affected them in terms of identity development, in terms of how it affected their adulthood, and finally integrity versus despair. So the developmental perspective on trauma was a key theme in the book.
Firstly, congratulations to the three of you for a very meaningful presentation today. After the 7th of October, the Israeli Defense Force said that you're going to see some terrible things happening. And in a way, it felt to me that that was almost like a call for a suppression of empathy in terms of what we would be seeing on social media and on the media. And to build on Joel's concept of the omnipotent caregiver, some of us like to think of the idea as an omnipotent caregiver that is good. So my question is, during these very troubling times of war, how does one deal with the ambivalence of feeling empathy for those who are on the other side of the war, and also maintaining a sense of strong moral indignity in terms of what one has seen to be objectively barbaric behavior? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Martin. I think we should all answer that question, and my answer to you is, when you're in a state of trauma, you can't do that. That's the problem, is the empathy and the reasoning one fluctuates, and so today we feel terrible, tomorrow we'll be enraged, the next day we'll kill everyone, following day we think it's terrible. I think that's what we've got. And if you say to me, how do I rise above that? The answer is, the reasoning mechanisms aren't working because you're in trauma. And that's the problem. And so does the other side. So I'm very worried about where this will go and how it will end. And if we add into the mix that we've got a whole lot of people who are not really securely attached, not properly attached, that bodes really badly, because it means the visitors of hatred turn into residents and stay there. And that's what's been going on. Even in our own country, I'm worried about the impaired attachment. So Don Wilcox says when the proportion of people that are poorly attached gets too big, and I'm quoting, he says he's more dangerous than an atomic bomb. in society. And I think that's true. And so I'm very worried. I know the IMF's big plan is to eradicate Hamas. I know you can't eradicate hatred, and I know you can't eradicate hateful ideas. So they will eradicate a lot of orphans. But I'm worried that the next generation will come and kill you and your children and your grandchildren. That's what I'm worried about.
Martin, can I add something? Just adding on to something about sitting with all of this. And I think that I'm not disagreeing with Cora at all. I'm saying that I think we have to hold on to the ambivalence with all our might, with our nails, and be aware that there is an ambivalence. And when we know we lose that ambivalence and we lose our empathy, then we better go and sit and have a long talk with ourselves and realize that that ambivalence helps us to hold on to some kind of empathy and humanity. Because I think when we lose that completely, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, I also just wanted to come in. I think you really put it in a very complex way, Martin. With complex PTSD, part of the problem is that one is you having to hold a very complicated image in your mind. With most complex PTSD, people are being abused by the very people whose survival they depend on. And so inside, you have this kind of difficulty of saying good and bad have to sort of coexist. I think in this circumstance, really, you kind of answered the question and how you posed it. And as Tracey said too, is that we have to constantly keep trying to avoid splitting, if we can call it that, and psychological too. One has to kind of keep thinking about the complexity of the issues as you engage with them. And as Cora said, you will shift in and out of the capacity to do that space. So I think remaining connected to people who help you stabilize yourself and help you retain some sense of good in the world, and meaning in the world, and comprehensibility. Those are important things, because otherwise one kind of loses one sense of anchoring and also one sense of, I think a lot of people retreat from engagement too. I think that's the other thing that happens, referring back to Noel's point, is if I can't navigate this in a way that feels comprehensible, then I sort of retreat from other people as opposed to trying to keep doing that perhaps with other people.
We'll take the very last question.
Sorry, just a question, and maybe outside of the scope of the study. We spoke about the extent of attachment in different stages. Where children that come from homes of no attachment, or broken homes, if they were working at that stage, were there understandings or learnings around what that impact was down the line?
So yes, we did. We didn't have a child from a broken home, but we had a child who lost his mother tragically in his early childhood. He was 3 years old. His father then remarried, and he was sent to the grandmother. He didn't stay with the grandmother. He then came home. The stepmother was horrible to him, so he had very fragmented attachment. And he then went through a horrific experience in the camps. And so he didn't have that psychological resilience that Cora and Gill have spoken a lot about, to actually help him to process and to be in touch with any goodness. And what we saw with him was that he was extremely raging. He was angry a lot of the time. His post-traumatic stress was really bad. He was really depressed. And the worst symptom of his depression was irritability and rage. And unfortunately, his sons and his wife really suffered quite a lot, because he was unable to contain his rage and his fury. And so we know that not only did he experience terrible trauma, but he didn't have those early attachments to sustain him and help him to process this movement between good enough, bad enough, and overcoming suffering. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before you go, I'd just like to announce that we still have 30 copies of the book available, not here, in print. So I've been told you can pre-order them here today for a reduced price of 350 rands, and then you will receive them at a later stage. And also the authors are available to sign the purchased copies of the book in the foyer. So right after this, we can make our way to the foyer. Thank you very much to the Krista Maria Trust. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well done. Well done.
Talk is national. Well done.
Vix. I was about to message you, be like, no.